beyond normal, and that's praying because I've got a situation this weekend that I'm concerned about, and it's not a life. Well, I say it's not a life or death situation. I don't want it to turn into it. It has to do with weather and travel. So prayer is one of those things where when you need it, you're like, I want to pray. Well, can I tell you, we need it all the time, and we really need to. It's one of those things that's hard to grasp, I think, sometimes because prayer seems so alone at times. It seems ineffective at times, if we're just honest. It seems like maybe we're saying a prayer, but we're not getting an answer. And it's supposed to be a dialogue, right? And then, of course, there are these prayers that are, I think, just good for our soul. I have a lot of friends who are in churches that they do liturgies and they read prayers, and that's in a sense a little bit of a different thing, and I think those are beautiful too. But what is this thing called prayer? Why do we need it? Well, I've asked someone to join me today who has written a book that is out now. It is right here called When People Pray. And Brian Alarid is the president and CEO of America Prays, and we'll talk about that organization. But this is something that I just think is hugely underestimated, undervalued, and we need to be reminded sometimes of really the power and the significance of prayer. And I think sometimes you just understand it more. I know I'm 51 years old and I still don't feel like I completely understand it, but I want to. Brian, great to have you on Life Today Live.
Randy, thank you. Just an honor to be with you. Thank you.
So, give us a little bit of the overview of the organization America Prays so we can understand a little bit of kind of where you're coming from.
Yeah, so the vision of America Prays is to unite and equip 40,000 churches in 24/7 prayer for a national spiritual awakening. And so that movement began here in the city of Austin, Texas, about 12 years ago, in 2009. And there was a pastor by the name of Trey Kent, pastor of Northwest Fellowship, and God just one day on a prayer walk with his wife, Mary Ann, he just felt like God told him what would happen in the city of Austin if you asked every church to take one day a month and cover 1 day a month in prayer, and then Assembly of God Church on one day and a Baptist church the next day and a Lutheran church the next day, and cover those 24 hours, kind of a Moravian prayer chain style. So somebody prays at 1 a.m. and somebody prays at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. and et cetera, and what would happen. And at the same time, unbeknownst to Trey, there's a pastor by the name of Jason Hubbard up in Bellingham, Washington, who on the same day, January 1st, 2009, started a movement in Bellingham, Washington, asking churches to take a monthly day of prayer. And so there was this idea, what would happen if you could create a canopy, a covering of day and night prayer over your city? And so I discovered this model. I was working for the Billy Graham Association back in 2016. Franklin Graham was going to all 50 states, and I was in charge of mobilization for 10 of those states, including Texas. And so came here to Austin, Texas, met Trey. We brought him on our team as our city captain and he had a movement called Unceasing Prayer. Tell me, what's that? How does that work? And he said, the church is the house of prayer. And I'm like, yeah, how does that work though? And he goes, on the first day of the month, the Baptist church goes and they do it their way. On the Baptist day of prayer, everybody gets saved. And on the second day, the Pentecostal church goes and they're calling down tongues of fire. And then on the third day, it's the Reformed church, and we're quoting Piper and Spurgeon and Tim Keller, and to be very theologically astute. And then the fourth day is the Charismatic church, and they're blowing the shofar off key and waving the flags, and having just a wild party. And then the fifth day is the Bible church, and they exegete Leviticus 16 on their day of prayer. And I said, Trey, that's a brilliant model of united prayer. What a great way to bring the body of Christ together in a city. I said, man, you should take that national. Like, I think that would work in Albuquerque. That would work in Dallas, Miami. And honestly, that would work anywhere because it wouldn't depend on your weekend attendance or your annual budget or your worship style. A smaller church could take a half a day, and a medium church could take a full day. A larger church could take a full day. It didn't depend if you were left leaning or right leaning or, charismatic or reformed, that every church could take their day of prayer. And Trey said, I don't feel like I'm the guy to do that. Maybe you're the guy. And I'm like, no, I'm just the guy making sure that people show up at the prayer rally when Franklin Graham comes to town. And, but through a set of circumstances, we ended up doing that in New Mexico. A lot of it had to do with my daughter being in the hospital and God getting my attention and surrendering to the call. And so we launched New Mexico Praise in 2017, and then that grew into America Praise. And within 3 months of launching America Praise in 2017, Randy, we had churches in Japan and India and Sri Lanka praying with us. And the chairman of our board is a man by the name of Dick Eastman, written many, many books on prayer. And he's the president of Every Home for Christ as well. So Dick said, Brian, how is Sri Lanka part of America Praise? And I'm like, well, it's not really, but there were churches there that loved the model, loved the vision, wanted to do it. And he goes, I think we need to start World Praise. And so we launched World Praise, and it expanded to 10 nations. And so it's just this idea of equipping and mobilizing every church to be a house of prayer. That's really the mission statement, is every church a house of prayer.
Okay, I'm going to have to ask you about your daughter, have you come back to that. Can you turn the volume down on your end just a little bit? I'm getting some feedback over my voice through yours. But it's interesting how God was moving on different people in different places to do the same thing. And I think God does that a lot. We just don't always know it. And I got people watching from all over the country, all over the world right now. Hello, Judy. Hello, Katie. This is live. Carol, Nate. There's just a lot of people that across the world, God's communicating his heart, and we hear it. I want to, a couple of different things. You're in Austin right now, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we moved here last September.
Okay,
the city of Austin from
so
Albuquerque.
you know what I'm praying about, because I'm supposed to drive through there tomorrow and back on Sunday. And I don't know if you saw what happened in Fort Worth yesterday.
I did.
It was awful. I mean, terrifying. The video of that. My whole family, me and my wife, and 3 of my 4 kids are supposed to be on the road, and my first grandson that was born at the end of December. And I'm sitting here going, God, what do I do? I mean, I feel a certain weight of leadership in the family. Do I put my whole family on the road with the weather they're forecasting over the weekend, which is highly unusual for Texas, which means nobody knows how to drive on it. And if it's ice, you just can't drive on it.
Right.
I'm curious, when you started getting into prayer heavily, what did you learn maybe that could help those of us who are praying over issues right now? Because someone here at work just lost someone this morning to COVID. So, I mean, I know these things are weighing on people, whether they're decisions, whether they're losses, they're pains. What, from your own experience, have you learned about what prayer does to give us peace, to give us guidance, to give us hope, direction, those things?
Yeah. Something I've learned, Randy, that's really impacted my life is that prayer is more about the object of prayer. Jesus is the object of our prayer. Prayer is more about the object of prayer, Jesus, than it is about the outcome of prayer. And I'm an outcomes guy. I love to see the outcomes. What's the impact of prayer? What's the outcome of prayer? And we prayed for the economy in New Mexico, and it went up. And we prayed for jobs, and they went up. And we targeted crime, and crime went down. And so I like to see I'm a real outcome-oriented guy. But you realize that prayer is more about the relationship and the impact that happens in you than it is in the outcome that it happens. We love praying for the sick, and we love praying for financial provision. We love praying for God to move. But I think the biggest movement that happens is the movement that happens inside of you. It's that you become a habitation for the presence of God. It's interesting that all the things that the disciples could have asked Jesus to teach them, turn water into wine. Like, could you teach me that? Because we can start our own brewery here on the Sea of Galilee, and we can make our own beer and wine, and fund the ministry. And the one thing they wanted to know from Jesus was, teach us how to pray. So the greatest leader that ever lived, they didn't ask, teach us leadership. The greatest communicator, preacher that ever lived, they didn't say, teach us how to preach. They said, teach us how to pray. And here's what I think that they saw, Randy, is they saw that Jesus' prayer life, his devotion to prayer, was his special connection to the Father that released supernatural power in his ministry. And so they said, we want the secret sauce. We want to know how to connect with the Father the way that you do. And so Jesus gave them, we call it the Lord's Prayer, but really it's the disciples' prayer. It's how to talk to God. And so, I'm learning through this journey in my own life that it's about Jesus. It's about fellowship. It's about friendship with God. Brother Lawrence said prayer is a conversation with God. But I've also learned that it's not only a conversation, but it's also an impartation from God. Because when you pray, when people pray, God does something in you. And I believe what happens is that you get a heart for the people that God has a heart for. God cares about the poor, cares about the marginalized, cares about the orphan, the widow, the immigrant. And so prayer is a conversation. It starts there, but it turns into impartation. In the book of Acts, they prayed, but they didn't stay in the prayer room. Prayer moved them to mission. And so we feel like prayer is always very missional in the way that God designed it, is that we spend time with God, we fellowship with him, but then he wants to put something in our heart to do. And for everyone who's watching, there's something that only you can do, that I can't do, that Randy can't do, that Pastor Robert Morris can't do, that Rick Warren can't do. There's an assignment that only you can do. And I think that happens through prayer, that prayer gives us the courage to chase the purpose and mission of God in our lives.
That's really good. I like that. And I think the difficulty is sometimes we don't know. Is that God? Is that what you want? It's hard. I don't doubt God. I doubt myself. But here's an interesting thing. This is a kind of a weird thing if you sit back and think about it. Jesus said he only does what he sees the Father doing. And you're like, dude, you're God. You can do whatever you want.
Right.
But there was that connection, and I think prayer, and what you're talking about, and it being about that relationship between us and God the Father, which is just beyond my pay grade to really comprehend, but that's what he invites us to. And when we have that relationship, we know better what to do because we see the Father doing it.
That's right.
I like that. All right, this is the book. Again, I'm going to show it to you. It's When People Pray. Brian Alarid is the author of it, and it is out now, correct? This is not a pre-release?
Yep. It's out in paperback and Kindle and Audible. So, yeah.
Okay, so you guys can go pick it up right now if you want to, but we're going to keep talking about this idea of prayer. Tell me about your daughter. What happened to you that you alluded to earlier?
Yeah, Randy, so what happened is 2016, I was pastoring in Albuquerque. My wife, Mercy, and I lived there. We were pastoring Passion Church, but I also worked full-time for the Billy Graham Association. And Franklin was going to all 50 states, and so one of my states was Texas. And during that journey, that spring of 2016, my daughter, Chloe, she was 12 at the time, our firstborn daughter, she started to get stomach aches. And so we'd take her to the, first urgent care, and then they got so bad it would be the ER, and they would test her and couldn't find anything wrong with her. They'd send us home. And by the time we got home, she was in, really severe stomach pain. This went on for about 3-4 weeks. And that spring, I was on tour with the Billy Graham Association, mobilizing prayer. And my wife, Mercy, called me and said, babe, come home. They're taking Chloe from the ER to the main hospital. I said, that doesn't sound good. So got the next flight home to Albuquerque. And over the next 6 weeks, Chloe went from stomach pain to wheelchair. She stopped walking. She lost mobility in her limbs and couldn't walk, couldn't stand up on her own unassisted. And then she couldn't move the left side of her body, just like no feeling, no movement in her left arm or left leg. And then she couldn't open her eyelids one day. And like, why can't she open her eyelids? And they had no explanation for what was happening. On May 13th, 2016, we're at Children's Hospital in Albuquerque. And she had a crash, and she had completely, her body crashed, and she had complete amnesia. And so at 4 a.m., the neurologist came in to test her, and I had to hold her eyelids open so the neurologist could test her. And, what's your name? I don't know. What year is it? I don't know. And where do you go to school? What a school. So here's my 12-year-old star student athlete, straight A student, starting point guard on her JV team, running track, can't walk, and now she doesn't even know her name. And I just, as a dad, man, my heart just broke, And about 4 hours later, the head of neurology came in and said, we don't know what's happening to your daughter. Could have been a stroke. It could have been some kind of virus that attacked her nervous system. We really don't understand it yet. We think that she'll recover from amnesia. We think that her eyelids at some point will open up again. We think with therapy, she could regain movement and feeling in her left arm. Her speech is slurred, that with therapy, we should, be able to work through that. But we don't think she'll ever walk again. That we think is going to be permanent. We don't really know what it is, but we don't think she'll ever walk again. And so that was May 13th, Randy, to hear your 12-year-old daughter's never going to walk again. And they said, we can't understand. She has level 10 nerve pain in her stomach, the kind of nerve pain that a vet coming back in Afghanistan or Iraq has, that stepped on a bomb or landmine. We don't understand why she has that kind of level 10 nerve pain in her stomach. And the only medication we have for it, she's allergic to it. And so they said, She'd never walk again. She'd have to learn how to live with level 10 nerve pain. And my heart just broke. And my wife is a professor at Regent University online of discipleship, but she also was professor at the time of early child education at Central New Mexico. So she had to leave to teach her class that she had written. And I'm all alone, Randy. And they put my daughter to sleep because she was in so much pain. They put her to sleep. And I just go to the corner of the room and I said, God, don't take my baby girl. Please don't take my baby girl. And for about an hour, wrestled with God, cried, as you can imagine, as any parent would. And, I heard this still small voice that said, Brian, if you'll start 24/7 prayer, I'll take care of your baby girl. And honestly, Randy, I was really upset at God. I'm embarrassed to admit that, but I was really upset.
Almost sounds like blackmail.
I just said, God, how could you do that? Right. Like right now, I'm like the last guy you want to champion the power of prayer. Because right now, excuse my English, I think prayer sucks. You know what I mean? I'm like, 6 weeks ago, my daughter had a tummy ache. Now she can't walk. She doesn't know her name. She can't open her eyelids, and I'm not happy right now with prayer. And I'm not the guy to get up and say, yeah, rally the troops to prayer. So you got the wrong guy. And right now, I just want to quit ministry. I don't want to do more. I'll quit the Bill and Graham Association. I'll quit my church. We'll figure out healthcare. I just want to be by my daughter's side. I believe that she's going to walk again. I believe that she has a call in her life to the nations, and she's a singer and a worship leader. And I just believe that with all my heart that I don't know how long that's going to take, but I believe. And God, I don't want to do more ministry. But you know what? God's always going to win. We wrestle, but he's going to win, right? And he had me at my most vulnerable spot. I just felt so broken and so fried emotionally and spiritually. And so finally I surrendered and said, okay, God, we'll start 24/7 prayer here in Albuquerque. What Jason Hubbard's doing in Bellingham, what Trey Kent's doing in Austin, we can figure that out here in Albuquerque, how to get 30 churches or more to take a day of prayer. And so I knew about 300 pastors in our state. And so I figured we could get 30 of them to do it. And at the still small voice of God came back a second time and said, not just Albuquerque, but all 50 states, and not just America, but I want you to raise up a movement of day and night prayer to cover every city, every state, every nation until I come back. And then I knew Randy, I was in big trouble because that sounded so intimidating. And I would have said at that time that our church was a praying church. I wouldn't have said it was a house of prayer, though. So I was just kind of like, God, I'm not sure how to get our church to pray more, much less a city or a state or a nation or 200 plus nations and territories. And so, God, I don't know how to do that, but if you'll give me this strength, then we'll obey. So we surrendered. My wife got back from teaching her class. I said, babe, I heard the voice of God. I'm really scared, but I feel like Chloe's miracle is tied to our obedience and prayer. It's not something I really want to do, but I just feel like God's calling us to devote our lives to prayer. I don't even know what that means or looks like, really, but we're supposed to mobilize prayer. And Randy, 2 days later, my daughter Chloe got up out of her wheelchair after they had said she'd never walk again. And it was equal part joy and relief and equal part just brutal pain, because here's my track star, my point guard. She took 5 steps and crumbled in my arms. Her legs just caved in. And yet she took 5 steps. They'd said she'd never walk again, and she took 5 steps. And so there was hope. There was a glimmer of hope that maybe God could do something in her life, Her memory started to come back. She recognized her brother and her sister, and okay, I'm Chloe. Yeah, you're Chloe. And we carried her that May 15th, we carried her out of the hospital, and she's walking from the wheelchair, taking a few steps to get into my wife's minivan. And God said, I kept my end of the bargain. Are you going to keep your end? And then I'm like, oh no, no, I got to mobilize day and night prayer.
Sure.
And so that was the genesis of it. Was May 13th of 2016 was, go all in.
How's Chloe doing today?
Randy, it's been a difficult journey. It's been almost 5 years of really difficult journey, but she's doing a lot better. She can run, she can walk. I mean, she's for the most part healthy. There's been some lingering stomach issues, some lingering migraines. And so we still need that final touch of God's healing power, but we're grateful that her memory came back. It took about 6 months. She could walk unassisted and again, and, things started to get better. We started to get her stomach pain under control. And so I would say she's about 90% today. And so still needs that final touch. And I've learned more from unanswered prayer than I have from answered prayer.
Well, okay.
And that's the truth. I've learned more from unanswered prayer than I have from answered prayer. And you realize that prayer's more about learning how to trust God
Yeah.
than it is the answer to, because the answer to the prayer is the easy part for God, right? Like that's easy. Boom, God speaks and it is. So that's the easy part. It's getting us to trust God. It's getting us to surrender fully to Him. That's the hard, that takes a long time.
Yeah.
And so we've been in a place of 5 years as a family of just surrendering to the call of God to say, all right. So ended up giving up my church, ended up leaving the Billy Graham Association and say, all right, I'll devote the rest of my life to missional prayer, to prayer, moving people to mission. And, but you know what? God's been so faithful. I wouldn't have it any other way. And,
I want to ask you about that. People are asking, did you ever get a diagnosis for your daughter? People are just wondering.
there was never a diagnosis.
Never a diagnosis.
There was never, they could never quite figure out what happened. But it's amazing. God called us to move after 22 years in Albuquerque, called us to Austin, Texas. Last fall, we moved here in September, and we found a spirit-filled doctor here who was able to help figure some things out. And he said, I don't know exactly what happened 5 years ago. He goes, it was probably some kind of random virus that attacked her nervous system. And then there was this chain of reactions that happened to her body, to her migraines, her stomach. And he said, but I believe that with prayer and with just all organic treatments, we can reverse the curse. And in the last 5 months, it's been remarkable what God's done here in Austin with Chloe's health. And so God's been so faithful. And but I know out there right now, there's people with loved ones, that haven't been healed. And that's hard to understand sometimes why God heals some and He doesn't heal others. And so through that, we've just had to learn how to trust and surrender to the sovereignty of God, right? We don't understand this. I do know that God heals. I do know that God is a healing God. He's a faithful God. He's a miracle working God. And yet, Brother Job went through some hard times, Our brother the Apostle Paul had a thorn in the flesh that didn't go away. And so sometimes prayer is about giving us courage to walk through some very dark trials. And and through it all, God's faithful.
Yeah, and so I'm curious, since that moment, because that's unusual, that kind of bargaining kind of, I'll heal your daughter if you'll obey me. That's a little hard, honestly.
I'm not gonna. It is.
And so I'm curious. What I want to know is sort of the fruit of that transaction. What's it been like for you and your wife, aside from your daughter improving but still having difficulties? What has it been for you and your wife, just emotionally, spiritually, just situationally, since going all in?
Randy, it's been a very emotional 5 years. There's things about the sovereignty of God you just don't understand, and why sometimes things are delayed, and why God doesn't do things quickly. But you know what we've learned the Father's love, and that it was the Father. Jesus says, the verse we quote out, John 3:16, for God so loved, it's the Father. Jesus is saying, because my Father so loved the world, He sent me, His one and only begotten Son. And I heard the Lord say this, and He said, will you allow your daughter to suffer so that we can create a prayer movement? And I said, no, I'll suffer. Mm-hmm. I'm willing to suffer, but I don't want my daughter to suffer. And I just heard the Father say, that's what I went through. The greatest sacrifice is not even what Jesus did, but it's what the Father did, right? Because all of us I would suffer for my kids. I'd suffer for my wife and a few of my friends. Some of my friends I wouldn't, but a lot of them I would, right? That sacrificial, like I would suffer for you. We get that, right? We understand that vicarious suffering. Let me suffer on your behalf. And yet what the Father did was the ultimate sacrifice, because He let His Son suffer. And that's something that's just love from another world that we don't understand. And so the Father said, will you allow your daughter to suffer for a season so that I can begin to mobilize prayer? And you just don't understand that. It's hard to understand. But you know what? You sacrifice and you die to yourself. And Christ said, come and give up everything. Give up everything and come and follow me. And what the fruit of that has been is that God has mobilized prayer, both nationally and globally. There's things that have come out. I see the fruit of it. And, the other day, my daughter Chloe said to me, she goes, Dad, it was worth it.
Hmm.
It was worth it to go with everything that we went through as a family. It was worth it because look at what God is doing. And out of that came this vision to pray for everybody in the world by name and share the gospel with them in their heart language. And 4 years from the date that Chloe's in the hospital, May 13th, 2020, I had a conversation with my good friend, Mark Green, the chairman of the board of Hobby Lobby.
Yeah.
And I shared with him this vision we had to pray for everybody in the world by name. 8 billion people prayed for, cared for, hear the gospel in their native language. And Mark Green said, let's do it together. Let's chase this. And so out of that came this global coalition called Pray Beyond. Pray for every man, woman, and child of the world by name, because God knows their name and he wants us to know their name. And pray for them and share the gospel. And so the other day, Chloe said, Dad, it was worth it, wasn't it? I said, it was. I have a broken heart, and that hasn't gone away. But it was worth it. It was worth it to sacrifice whatever we had to go through as a family, which is small compared to one of my dearest friends. She lost her dad and brother last year to COVID. And so, that's why, the Bible says, do not think it's strange when you go through fiery trials of all kinds, right? Don't think it's strange. Don't think that you're the only one going through suffering. I could think of some of my friends in India that have suffered and been beaten for the gospel. And so, we all have a price to pay. And D.L. Moody said the world's yet to see what God can do through a man or woman who's fully surrendered to God. And he said, by God's grace, I endeavor to be that man. And so, you know what? We all have our own cross to bear. For us, it was, the health of our daughter for 5 years now. But for someone else, it was a different sacrifice. But, without sacrifice, there's no real love. Love is sacrifice. And will you sacrifice that which you love the most? And so for me, it was an Isaac moment. Will you give me your Isaac? Will you give me your firstborn? Will you sacrifice? And I'm not going to say it was easy, Randy, but I would say it was worth it to see what God's done by mobilizing prayer on a global scale. It's been worth it. Hasn't been easy. It sure has been worth it.
Yeah. Well, that's good, man. I appreciate you just being open and honest and real about that, because people need to hear that. In fact, there's a great quote that you open your book with, A.W. Tozer quote, that says, a scared world needs a fearless church.
That's right.
Where do you see things going with the church? I mean, obviously in the United States, there's a lot of people that think we're on a fast track to hell. I think God's still in control. But globally, you mentioned India. There are parts of India where it can cost you your life to be a Christian. China, same way. I view this earth as the crossroads of heaven and hell. I see both of it, man. I see God moving in places, and I see just complete destruction of lives in other places. The world needs a church that's fearless. What do you see that as?
There's a couple things that I see, Randy. I see it getting both better and worse at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. Mike Bickle says, is it going to get better or worse? Yes. Right. Both.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's kind of the paradox, the tension of Isaiah 60 verse 2, that as gross darkness covers, we're seeing gross darkness. We're seeing gross darkness, immorality, all the things that are happening right now in America, just gross division, gross darkness. My glory will be seen upon you. And so we're going to see incredible darkness cover the earth. And we're seeing in America, we're just at the tipping point of some really ugly stuff, really some unbiblical stuff happening. And yet I believe God's going to have a glorified bride. And so about a year ago, Randy, just before COVID broke out, I was taking my son to Staples Center to watch a Lakers game. I'm from LA originally, so a big Lakers fan. And so I was preaching at a conference. And so I try and take each of my kids on at least one trip with me a year, and then before the conference or after, spend some family time. And so we went out a few days early before the conference, and we got to do the LA thing. And it was the end of February of 2020. And we were hearing a little bit like there was like 1 or 2 cases at that point in LA of COVID. And we went to the Staples Center, and then looking back, 20,000 people. I don't know if that probably was never sanitary, right? Forget COVID. That was probably never sanitary, right? But anyway, we were there, and I got back to my hotel, and I said, God, what's happening? And here's what I really felt like that still small voice said to me this. He said, China's made their move. Russia's making their move. Democrats are making their move. Republicans are making their move. Big tech is making their move. And he said, and it's going to be really ugly. But just wait. Don't be distracted. Just stay focused on me. And after all that plays out, I'll play my card. And I said, Lord, what's your card? Here's what I really believe he said. He said, my card is a unified, purified bride. My card. And so God hasn't played his card yet, right? I love Texas Hold'em. At my house, we play for jelly beans. We don't play for money or poker chips. We play for jelly beans, right? But Texas Hold'em, right? The deck of cards on the table, Randy, is ugly, not just in America, but globally. The deck of cards that's on the table is really ugly. But, Jesus has the ace of spades, and he hasn't played his card yet. And I believe the card that God's about to play is a unified, purified bride. And I said, well, how do we get a unified, purified? I don't see that. How do we get a unified, purified bride of Christ? And he said, I'm going to unite my bride through prayer, and I'm going to purify my bride through persecution and my word. And you think about the early church, how it was persecution that purified them, but also multiplied them. But it's also the washing of water by the word, Ephesians 5:26. And so I believe we're seeing more prayer actually right now than maybe at any point in human history. We're seeing more prayer on a global scale. And Google tracked it during COVID that every 2 weeks, prayer was doubling. Prayer doubled, prayer search doubled every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So we're probably seeing the greatest prayer movement in human history, but also see that persecution is arising, and it's no longer just in India and North Korea, but it's coming to America. And I honestly think that God's going to use that for good, because we've been too Laodicean and too lukewarm for way too long. And I think God's going to, I'm not saying it came from God, but God will use it. God will use everything. Romans 8:20, all things work together. So I believe that the persecution as it increases in America is going to really be used to purify his bride, to purify the church, so that we are that bride without spot or wrinkle that can shine a glorious light. When our bride isn't shining bright, the world doesn't want it.
Yeah.
But as the world gets darker and we get brighter with the light of Christ, the love of Christ, the grace of Christ, then that's attractional to a broken and a hurting world. And there's more pain than ever. I just think there's so much pain, there's so much hurt, there's so much confusion and strife. People are looking for some place where they can find unity. And I pray that he'll find it in his church.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you talk about the situation, and still it's better in America than pretty much anywhere. Most places in the world, yeah. But we still haven't hit the level of Rome when Paul was there, and that's where the church was persecuted but was built. And so there's hope. I mean, you just read the book of Romans. I think it's a great roadmap for wherever you're at in the world. So,
That's
Brian,
right.
we could keep going. This is such a great, deep subject, and I'd love to. There's one thing before I let you go. I want to ask about the website. What can people expect? Can they connect with you there? Can they get involved in prayer? What all do you offer there?
Absolutely. So America Prays, prays.org. You can sign up as an individual, as a church, as a ministry, or as a business to take a monthly day of prayer, to get involved and take a monthly day of prayer. So you can take an hour a day, or as a church or a ministry or business, you could take a monthly day of prayer. And so they can go there and sign up. And right now we're launching a pilot project here in Austin to pray for 2.2 million people in the greater Austin area by name. Every single person prayed for by name, and share the gospel with them. And so that's part of what we're working on right now, this pilot project here in Austin. And but yeah, people can sign up, and then whenpeoplepray.com, there's some resources around our book. There's a discussion guide and things like that around the book. And we've had churches teach them, do series, small group series around the book, a men's group around the book. And but really it's this, it's Mark 11:17. Jesus said, my house shall be called a house of prayer. He didn't say my church. So a lot of times Mark 11:17 gets misquoted in churches. The church is supposed to be a house of prayer. Not what the man said. Jesus said, my house, right? Greek word is oikos, not ecclesia, not church, but my house. And oikos is the Greek word for family or household. And so really the better way to translate Mark 11:17 is really, my family will be known as a family of prayer for all nations. And so that's what God wants, is that every family a house of prayer, every couple a house of prayer, every church a house of prayer, every business a house of prayer, every school a house of prayer, every city a house of prayer, every nation a house of prayer, because prayer unlocks mission. Well, why prayer? What's the end game? The end game isn't prayer. The end game is mission. A house of prayer for all nations. That prayer unlocks mission. That every ethnic group in the world will hear the gospel in their heart language. And so prayer always moves us to mission. We like to say the book of Acts is the story of what happened in between prayer meetings, right? Because it's prayer and mission. Prayer, serve the poor. Prayer, preach the gospel. Prayer, care for the orphan, the widow, right? And so prayer moved us to mission, so they can get involved there at americapraise.org.
Excellent. Brian, I appreciate your time, appreciate your commitment, and just helping us understand and go back to that thing that is so critical and, just like I said in the intro, overlooked, and that's prayer. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Randy. Honored to be with you today. Thank you, friend.
Appreciate all you guys hanging out and watching. Share this. If you haven't followed or subscribed, please do it. And all those times you wonder, what can I do? I don't know what to do, whether it's for yourself, for your family, for your community, for your nation, for the world, you can pray. And there's some great resources we've given you today to check it out and getting connected with other people who are praying. So there you go. And I pray you will consider being a serious part of that. And again, of course, come back next week. We've got more great interviews. Hopefully I'll be here Monday. If not, it's because the weather got me here in Texas. But definitely be back Tuesday through Friday and encourage you some more. Have a great weekend. I'll see you next time here on Life Today Live.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my happy privilege and pleasure to present the man that God has raised up with a message for your deliverance.
There is no distance in prayer. You don't have to go anywhere or be in any specific place. It is the believing of the heart. It is faith in God. You believe it, say